A poor girl shielded the cold millionaire CEO in the riot. His recovery forced him to expose her traitor. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's return to our main character. Ethan Caldwell had built his life on distance, measured words, and an iron calm that never cracked in public. A self-made CEO whose presence alone could quiet a room. And on a cold afternoon in downtown Chicago, that calm was tested in a way no boardroom ever could. As a crowd gathered outside the glass-fronted Civic Center where Ethan was scheduled to speak at a charity forum, the air sharp with winter wind, the sidewalks packed shoulder to shoulder, banners fluttering, voices rising and falling like a restless tide, while Ethan waited just inside the revolving doors, coat buttoned, jaw set, security murmuring updates into earpieces, the city clock across the street ticking past noon, and then the noise swelled unexpectedly. Not chaos, not fear, just a sudden surge of movement as people pressed forward at once. A bottleneck forming near the entrance, the temperature dropping as a gust funneled through the street canyon. And in that brief, unguarded moment, when attention split and space collapsed, a young woman in a worn gray coat stepped out of the flow and into his path. Her name was Claire Morgan, and she was not supposed to be there. She was a volunteer assigned to distribute hand warmers and bottled water at the perimeter, someone easy to overlook, someone used to standing at the edges. But when she saw Ethan hesitate as the crowd shifted, saw his footing falter on the slick stone, saw confusion ripple through the line, she did not think of cameras or titles or consequences. She simply moved, placing herself between him and the cold surge, lifting her coat open and bracing her stance, shoulders squared, breath steady, creating a pocket of stillness with her own body as the wind cut hard across the plaza, the fabric of her coat thin, the chill biting through. Yet she held fast, eyes locked forward, voice low and calm as she said it was okay. Stay close, don't move. And Ethan, startled by the sudden warmth and the unhesitating courage in a stranger's voice, felt the moment slow, the noise dull, his world narrowing to the rise and fall of her breath and the faint scent of laundry soap. He did not know her name then, did not know the long night shifts she worked or the bus routes she memorized by heart. Only that someone had chosen him, chosen to stand, chosen to shield. And as security regained control and the doors opened wide, ushering them both inside, the warmth broke, the chill rushed back, and Claire's knees wobbled for just a second before she steadied herself, offering a small, embarrassed smile as if she had done nothing remarkable at all, while Ethan's pulse hammered, an unfamiliar ache tightening in his chest, because for the first time in years, the cold he carried did not come from the weather. It came from the realization that he had been protected by someone who owed him nothing, and that realization would follow him into the hours ahead, into the sterile quiet of recovery rooms and the measured beeps of monitors, into questions that refused to stay silent. Because long after the crowd dispersed and the street returned to its ordinary rhythm, one truth remained. The girl in the gray coat had changed the trajectory of his life, and the reason she had been placed in harm's way would demand an answer. The ride to the hospital blurred into a muted tunnel of sound and motion, the city lights streaking past the ambulance windows like distant stars while the heater hummed against the winter air, and Ethan drifted in and out of awareness, his thoughts heavy and slow, anchored by a single sensation he could not shake, the memory of warmth where there should have been cold. And somewhere nearby Claire sat upright on the narrow bench, hands folded in her lap, her gray coat draped loosely around her shoulders, one sleeve damp from melted snow, her breathing measured though every muscle in her body ached from the sudden strain. She had insisted she was fine, had waved off the first responder with a quiet smile, saying others needed help more than she did, and now she stared at the floor, replaying the moment over and over, wondering why her heart still raced as if she had run miles instead of taken a single step forward. When the ambulance doors opened at the emergency entrance, the rush of warm air carried the scent of antiseptic and coffee. Nurses moved with calm efficiency, voices low and steady, and Ethan was guided away on a rolling bed, his coat folded carefully and placed beside him, while Claire was led in another direction, a clipboard pressed briefly into her hands, questions asked and answered in clipped exchanges, her name, her age, whether she felt dizzy, whether she had anyone to call, and she shook her head at the last one, not because there was no one in the world, but because there was no one she wanted to worry. Minutes later, she found herself seated alone beneath fluorescent lights that buzzed faintly, the waiting area nearly empty. A clock on the wall ticking loud enough to mark each passing second. She flexed her fingers, noticing a faint tremor, and pulled her coat tighter, unaware that Ethan, in a quiet room down the hall, was fighting to stay awake, his mind circling back to the same image, a woman stepping forward without hesitation, not asking who he was, not asking what he could give, only asking him to stay still, to trust her. Hours passed, measured in paper cups of water and the soft squeak of shoes on linoleum, and eventually a nurse approached Claire with a polite nod, telling her she was cleared to leave, suggesting rest and warmth. Handing her a pamphlet she tucked into her pocket without reading, she stood, shouldered her bag, and paused for a moment at the end of the corridor, looking back toward the room she could not see into, wondering if the man she had shielded was all right. Then she turned and walked out into the early evening, the cold sharper now, her breath visible in the air as she waited for the bus. Meanwhile, Ethan slipped into a deeper sleep, monitors humming softly. Beside him, his features relaxed for the first time that day. And in that stillness, his subconscious filled the gaps his waking mind could not, replaying the sound of her voice, the steadiness in it, the way the chaos had faded when she stepped close, and when he finally woke again. The room was dim, the city outside reduced to a scatter of lights beyond the window. A doctor stood nearby explaining that he had experienced a brief collapse likely triggered by stress and cold exposure, that he would recover fully with rest, that he was fortunate. Ethan listened, nodding, but his attention drifted, already reaching for something beyond the facts, beyond the charts and reassurance, because gratitude was settling into him like an unfinished thought, insistent and unresolved. And when his assistant arrived, relief etched across her face, he asked the first question that mattered, not about the schedule or the press or the board meeting postponed for the next day, but about the woman from the entrance, the one in the gray coat. And when no one could answer him, when no name appeared on the intake list connected to his room, a quiet determination took hold, because he knew, even then, that the day was not over, that the cold afternoon downtown had set something in motion, and that the distance he had built so carefully around his life had been crossed by a stranger who walked away without asking for anything in return. Morning arrived quietly, filtered through pale winter light that slipped between the blinds of Ethan's hospital room, and when he opened his eyes this time, the fog had lifted, leaving him alert, restless, and unable to ignore the absence that pressed at him more heavily than the thin blanket across his legs, because the first clear thought he had was that the woman in the gray coat was gone, that she had walked back into the cold without a name recorded, without a thank you spoken, without anyone stopping her to ask why she had stepped forward at all, and that knowledge unsettled him more than the doctor's warnings about stress or the polite concern in his assistant's voice when she arrived with a tablet and a carefully curated update on messages he had missed. He listened, nodded, answered where necessary, but his attention drifted repeatedly to the entrance of the room, half expecting someone to appear with news of the stranger, until finally he interrupted the briefing to ask, again, more firmly this time, whether anyone had identified the volunteer from the entrance, the one who had stayed with him before security intervened, and the answer was the same, no. Record, no badge scan, no follow-up, just a vague note about an unnamed volunteer cleared and released, which felt impossible to him, because he could still hear her voice, steady and close, as if it had anchored him in place. Later that afternoon he was discharged with instructions to rest and avoid public appearances for several days, and as his car pulled away from the hospital curb, he watched the city slide past with new eyes, every bus stop and crosswalk suddenly charged with significance, wondering where Claire Morgan might be at that exact moment. Though he did not yet know her name, across town, Claire's day had resumed with the familiar rhythm of necessity. She had slept for 4 hours on her narrow bed, woken before dawn, and layered her clothes carefully to trap warmth as she headed to her morning shift at a small diner just off the Blue Line. The kind of place where regulars ordered by habit and the coffee never quite tasted the same twice. She tied on her apron, flexed her sore shoulders once, and moved on, because that was what she had always done. She did not mention the previous day to anyone, not to the cook who grumbled about the weather, not to the older waitress who complained about her knees. It felt unreal already, like a scene borrowed from someone else's life, except for the faint ache in her muscles and the memory of a man's surprised eyes when she told him to stay close. During her break, she sat at a corner table and scrolled through her phone, headlines sliding past. And there it was, a short article with a photo taken from a distance, reporting that a well-known technology executive had been briefly hospitalized after a public event downtown, expected to make a full recovery. Claire stared at the image longer than she intended, recognizing the coat, the posture, the sharp line of his profile. She had not known who he was, not really. She had only seen a person unsteady in the cold, and now the scale of the gap between their lives settled in, heavy and undeniable. That evening, Ethan returned to his penthouse, the space immaculate and silent, city stretching below like a map of light, and for the first time it felt inhospitable. He set his coat down and paused, noticing the faint crease along the sleeve where her hand had pressed, and instead of dismissing the thought, he followed it, ordering a full review of security footage from the event, instructing his team to locate the volunteer coordinator, requesting names, descriptions, anything that could lead him back to the woman who had altered his course without asking permission. Because something about the day before refused to remain in the past, it lingered, insisting on meaning. And as night fell over Chicago, too, lives moved forward along separate paths, unaware that the choice made in a moment of cold and crowd and courage had already bound them to the same unfolding truth. The search began quietly, without press releases or announcements, unfolding behind glass walls and closed doors as Ethan returned to his office for the first time since the incident, the skyline outside his window sharp and bright against the winter sky. Yet his focus remained fixed on a single unanswered question, because every report he reviewed circled back to the same gap, a missing name, a missing face, a person who had entered his life for less than a minute and left an imprint he could not dismiss. He instructed his head of security to compile every angle from the cameras near the Civic Center entrance, not to assign blame, not to review protocols, but to find her, to trace the path of the volunteer in the gray coat from the moment she stepped forward to the moment she walked away. The footage arrived in segments, grainy in places, crisp in others, and as it played on the screen, Ethan leaned forward, recognizing the tilt of her head, the way she planted her feet, as if she had decided something important. He watched as she faded into the flow afterward, head down, purposeful, unaccompanied, and the sight stirred a mix of admiration and unease, because it suggested intention rather than impulse. Across town, Claire moved through her day with the practiced efficiency of someone who had learned to leave moments behind, yet the city seemed intent on reminding her. A passing bus carrying a digital ad for the very foundation Ethan chaired, a radio host mentioning his recovery during a news break at the diner, each reference landing softly but persistently. She told herself it did not matter, that she had done what anyone decent would have done, but the truth pressed closer at night, when she removed her coat and noticed a faint crease along the sleeve. When she replayed the steadiness in his eyes after the chaos ebbed, she folded the coat carefully and placed it on the back of a chair, unaware that the same image was paused on a screen miles away. The search expanded methodically, volunteer sign in sheets cross-referenced, coordinator emails reviewed, schedules examined. Yet her name remained elusive, because Claire had filled in last minute for a friend who had fallen ill, taking a spare badge and an extra box of supplies without ceremony. A small kindness that now rendered her invisible to official records. The irony did not escape Ethan, who recognized that systems were designed to capture transactions, not intentions. Late that afternoon, he requested one more angle, the sidewalk camera across the street, and there she was again, clearer this time, waiting at a bus stop, shoulders hunched against the wind, rubbing her hands together for warmth. The frame froze, and for the first time, he saw the fatigue etched into her posture, the practicality of her shoes, the quiet resilience that had not registered in the rush. He felt something shift, an understanding that the gap between them was wider than he had assumed, and that crossing it would require care. Meanwhile, Claire found a folded card in her pocket, a volunteer hotline number she had slipped in earlier and forgotten. She stared at it for a moment before tucking it back away, choosing silence over attention, choosing to keep her life intact, even as the city whispered otherwise. As night settled, Ethan left the office later than planned, the streets below glowing amber, his car idling at the curb while he made a decision that surprised even him. He instructed his driver to take a longer route home, past the transit lines and neighborhood diners, places he had not visited without purpose in years, not because he expected to find her immediately, but because he needed to see the city as she might see it, to understand the world she returned to after stepping out of his. And somewhere between the hum of traffic and the rhythm of stoplights, he realized the search was no longer about closure or gratitude alone. It was about restoring balance to a moment that had been left unfinished. And as Claire locked up the diner at closing, pulling her coat tight and heading toward the bus stop under the glow of street lamps, both moved forward under the same winter sky, unaware that the distance between them was already narrowing, guided by a choice neither had planned to make. By the 5th day after the incident, the city had settled back into its routines, but neither of them had, because moments that change direction rarely announce themselves as such. They linger, reshaping priorities in quiet ways. And for Claire, that reshaping appeared as small disruptions, a distracted pause while refilling coffee, a missed step on the bus stairs, the sense of being watched even when she knew she was not. She told herself it was nothing, that exhaustion explained it. Yet when her shift ended and she stepped outside into the evening cold, she slowed, scanning the sidewalk with a caution she could not name. Across the river, Ethan stood in a conference room overlooking Lake Michigan, the glass reflecting his own image back at him, composed, controlled, and yet subtly altered. His team discussed logistics and schedules, a proposed appearance rescheduled for the following week. But he listened with only half his attention, because his thoughts were occupied by the footage from the bus stop, by the realization that Claire Morgan, whose name he now knew after finally locating a substitute volunteer record buried in an email thread, lived within a world he had never needed to navigate. He dismissed the meeting early and retreated to his office, dialing the number he had obtained with deliberate restraint, aware of the imbalance inherent in the act. The call rang twice, then went to voicemail, and he did not leave a message. Instead, he sat back, considering, choosing patience over intrusion. Meanwhile, Claire boarded her bus, standing near the door, one hand gripping the pole as the vehicle lurched forward, her phone vibrating briefly in her pocket. She ignored it, assuming it was another shift reminder or automated alert, and watched the streets pass, unaware of the calculation unfolding elsewhere. Later that night, Ethan instructed his assistant to arrange something simpler, less conspicuous, a visit to the diner listed under Claire's employment records, not as a benefactor or executive, but as a customer, someone unremarkable, because he understood now that gratitude expressed from a height could feel like obligation rather than thanks. The next morning dawned bright and brittle, sunlight glinting off patches of snow along the sidewalks, and Claire arrived at work early, tying her apron and greeting the cook with a nod, the bell above the door chiming steadily as the breakfast crowd filtered in. And then, midway through the morning rush, she noticed him, seated alone near the window, a dark coat draped neatly over the chair, posture relaxed yet attentive, his presence familiar in a way that tightened her chest. It took a moment for recognition to settle, and when it did, she nearly dropped the pot she was carrying, because the man she had shielded stood less than 10 feet away, not in a photograph or headline, but here, waiting. Their eyes met briefly, and in that instant, the noise of the diner receded, replaced by the echo of a cold afternoon and a shared pause between breaths. She approached his table with practiced composure, asking what she could get him, her voice steady despite the rush of memory. He ordered coffee, thanked her, and when she returned with the mug, he spoke her name softly, not as a demand, but as an acknowledgement. Claire Morgan. She froze for half a second, then exhaled, nodding, confirming what she already knew, that this encounter had not been accidental. He introduced himself simply, Ethan, leaving the rest unspoken. and said he wanted to thank her properly. She waved it off, repeating that it was nothing, that she had only done what anyone would have done, but he shook his head gently, explaining that not everyone steps forward when space collapses, that he remembered her voice more clearly than the sirens or the crowd. The sincerity in his tone disarmed her more than any title could have, and though she remained cautious, something softened, a recognition that he was not there to collect a debt, only to close a circle left open. As the morning continued around them, dishes clattering, sunlight shifting across the floor, two lives that had brushed past each other by chance began, quietly, to realign, unaware that this meeting marked the end of anonymity and the beginning of questions that would soon demand answers neither could yet anticipate. The days that followed unfolded with an unspoken rhythm, tentative and careful, as if both of them understood that something fragile had begun and neither wanted to break it by. Moving too fast, Ethan returned to the diner twice more that week, always during quieter hours, always ordering the same coffee, always sitting where the light from the window softened the lines of his face. And each time Claire served him with polite professionalism, though the tension between what had been shared and what remained unsaid hummed beneath every exchange. They spoke in fragments at first, about the weather, about the neighborhood, about how busy the diner became on weekends. Conversations that filled space without crossing boundaries. Yet even in their restraint, something shifted, because Ethan listened in a way Claire was not accustomed to, asking follow-up questions, remembering small details, noticing when she favored one shoulder after long shifts, while Claire observed him with equal curiosity, noting how he never checked his phone while she spoke, how he thanked the cook directly, how he blended into the room without trying to command it. One afternoon, as snow began to fall again outside, he asked if she would mind walking with him for a few minutes after her shift, framing it as a request rather than an expectation, and she hesitated only briefly before agreeing, pulling on her coat and stepping into the cold beside him. They walked along the block, past storefronts and bus stops, their breath clouding the air, and for the first time, Claire asked the question she had been holding back, whether he had recovered fully. He assured her that he had, that the doctors were satisfied, that the incident had been a wake-up call, and though he did not elaborate, she sensed the truth beneath the words. They spoke then about ordinary things, about favorite meals and early mornings, about how winter in Chicago demanded preparation and patience, and in that ordinariness, a quiet trust began to form, because neither was performing for the other. Ethan did not mention his company or his resources, and Claire did not recount the sacrifices that had shaped her life, both choosing presence over explanation. As they reached the corner where she usually caught her bus, he thanked her again, not for the moment downtown, but for walking with him now, for treating him like a person rather than a headline. And the sincerity of it caught her off guard, because it reflected something she had not realized she needed, the simple acknowledgement of who she was. Without qualification, later that evening, Ethan returned home with a sense of calm that had been absent for years, yet beneath it stirred unease, because as his world narrowed to include Claire, other parts of his life pressed forward, unfinished business he could no longer ignore, security briefings resumed, internal reviews reopened, and subtle discrepancies emerged in the reports surrounding the day of the incident. Inconsistencies that suggested coordination rather than coincidence, and, while he pursued these quietly, determined not to involve Claire until he understood the scope, she too felt a shift, a heightened awareness that the connection forming between them existed within a larger context she did not yet see. Coworkers began to tease her lightly about her new regular, and though she laughed it off, she guarded the truth, sensing that labels would complicate something still finding its shape. One evening, as they stood together beneath a street lamp, snow collecting softly on the brim of Ethan's coat, he confessed that he had not told her everything, that there were aspects of his life he was not ready to share, and instead of demanding answers, Claire nodded, appreciating the honesty of the admission, telling him that everyone carried layers, that trust did not require full disclosure all at once. Her response surprised him, because it granted space without distance. And as they parted that night, each returning to their separate routines, the bond between them deepened not through grand gestures or revelations, but through restraint, through the deliberate choice to see one another as equals in the moments they shared. unaware that the quiet they were building would soon be tested by truths that refused to remain hidden. As the week turned and the city settled into a softer rhythm, the space between Ethan and Claire filled with small, deliberate moments that felt earned rather than arranged. They shared coffee after closing when the diner lights dimmed and the rush faded, sitting in a booth by the window while snow traced slow patterns on the glass. And in those quiet minutes, they learned the contours of each other's lives without prying. Ethan spoke of building something from nothing, of nights spent alone, refining plans that finally worked, of the cost of being measured by outcomes rather than intentions, while Claire spoke of early mornings and late buses, of learning to stretch meals and patience, of the dignity she guarded fiercely even when circumstances pressed. Their words never rushed, their silences comfortable, because listening had become a form of care. One afternoon, Ethan suggested a walk along the river, choosing a path open to the public, unremarkable and honest, and Claire agreed, pulling her scarf tighter as they moved beneath bare trees and winter light. He noticed how she paused to watch a street musician warming his hands between songs, how she dropped a few coins into a paper cup with a smile that held gratitude rather than pity, and something in that gesture stayed with him. Later, they stopped at a small bookstore, the kind with creaking floors and handwritten recommendations taped to shelves, and Claire lingered over a collection of essays, tracing a finger along the spine as if committing it to memory. Ethan bought it without comment and pressed it into her hands outside, telling her it belonged with someone who would read it slowly. She protested, then accepted, touched by the thoughtfulness rather than the price, because he had noticed what mattered to her. As days passed, the bond deepened through consistency, not spectacle. Ethan arrived when he said he would, left when he needed to, and never asked her to bend her schedule for his. Claire, in turn, trusted him with small truths, the ache in her shoulder that lingered, the worry about rent rising again, the hope she carried quietly to enroll in evening classes someday. And when she shared these things, he did not offer solutions, only presence, which felt like respect. Yet beneath the warmth, undercurrents stirred. Ethan's attention occasionally drifted during conversations, his jaw tightening when his phone buzzed with messages he ignored, and Claire sensed the weight he carried, the unspoken edges of his life pressing closer. One evening, as they stood beneath the glow of a street lamp, she asked gently whether he was all right, and he admitted there were matters he was addressing, remnants of the day they met that did not sit right with him. He did not elaborate, but the seriousness in his tone made her nod, trusting his judgment while bracing for change. Meanwhile, Ethan's private inquiry advanced, timelines compared, communications reviewed, patterns emerging that suggested manipulation within his own circle, and the realization unsettled him, because it reframed the incident as something more deliberate than misfortune. Still, he chose to shield Claire from the implications, believing she deserved peace, not proximity to his conflicts. The choice weighed on him, because honesty had become a shared value, but protection had too, and he balanced them carefully. Late one night, after walking Claire to her bus stop, Ethan lingered, hands tucked into his coat, watching the bus pull away, the reflection of her face passing behind the windows. And he understood then that what bound them was not the moment of rescue alone, but the days that followed, the mutual decision to show up without pretense, to meet as two people rather than roles. Across town, Claire sat by the bus window, the book resting on her lap, the city lights blurring into soft streaks, and she smiled without knowing why, sensing that something steady was forming, something that made the winter feel less sharp, even as questions gathered quietly at the edges, because both of them could feel it. The calm they were building would not last forever, and when it broke, it would demand courage of a different kind. The shift from calm to unease arrived without ceremony, woven into ordinary days until Ethan could no longer separate intuition from evidence, because the more he retraced the hours surrounding the incident, the more the margins filled with details that did not align. A security clearance adjusted minutes earlier than scheduled, a vehicle rerouted without authorization, a message sent from an internal account that should have been dormant, and while none of it amounted to proof on its own, together they formed a pattern that pressed against his sense of order. He spent late nights reviewing logs and timelines, the city outside his office dark and reflective, his reflection staring back at him as if asking what he would do with the truth once it took shape. Meanwhile, Claire noticed the change before he spoke of it. The way his gaze lingered on passing crowds. The way he paused mid-sentence when his phone vibrated. The way his shoulders tightened as if bracing for a gust that had not yet arrived. She did not push, choosing trust over interrogation, but she felt the weather shift all the same. One evening, as they walked along the river path again, the water moving slow and black beneath the lights, Ethan stopped and admitted that something about the day they met still troubled him, that what had seemed like coincidence now felt arranged. He spoke carefully, measuring each word, and though he avoided specifics, the seriousness of his tone cut through the cold. Claire listened, hands tucked into her sleeves, sensing the weight behind his restraint. She asked only one question, whether anyone else might be hurt by what he was uncovering, and when he hesitated before answering, she understood that the answer was not simple. The following morning, Ethan's suspicions sharpened into clarity. During a meeting he had not intended to attend, a routine briefing where Victor Hale, his long-trusted operations director, presented a summary of security enhancements implemented since the incident. The language was polished, the assurances smooth, yet a single phrase caught Ethan's attention, a reference to a contingency that had not been approved until after the event, and when he requested clarification, Victor deflected with practiced ease, attributing it to a clerical oversight. But the explanation rang hollow, because Ethan had signed every relevant authorization himself. After the meeting, he requested the raw data, bypassing intermediaries, and what emerged confirmed his unease. Communications sent from Victor's credentials aligning too neatly with the disruptions that had funneled movement toward the entrance at the precise moment Ethan had arrived. It was subtle, deniable, yet deliberate, and the realization landed with a chill more cutting than the winter air, because betrayal, unlike chaos, implied intent. Across town, Claire's day unfolded as usual, but she felt the tension travel with her, a quiet vigilance settling into her bones. She caught herself scanning faces on the bus, noticing how often unfamiliar cars idled near the diner, telling herself she was imagining things, that stress could create patterns where none existed. Yet when Ethan arrived that afternoon, later than expected, his expression resolute, she knew the threshold had been crossed. He asked if they could talk somewhere private, choosing a public park bench rather than an enclosed space. And when they sat, he shared more than he had before. Not names, not accusations, but the shape of the truth, that the incident appeared to have been manipulated by someone within his organization, that he was pursuing the matter carefully, that he did not want her involved beyond awareness. Claire absorbed this in silence, the pieces aligning in her mind, the memory of security shifts, the way the crowd had surged, the ease with which the path had opened, and a cold understanding settled. She had not stepped into randomness, she had stepped into a breach. She asked whether the person responsible knew about her, and Ethan answered honestly, that he did not know yet, but that he intended to ensure she was safe. The word safe echoed between them, heavy with implication, because it suggested risk without naming it. They sat there longer than planned, the park emptying as dusk fell, and when they finally stood, an unspoken agreement formed, that honesty would guide them even as discretion protected them. That trust would not be blind, but it would be chosen. Later that night, Ethan finalized his plan, compiling evidence with methodical precision, preparing to confront the truth in daylight rather than shadows. While Claire lay awake listening to the city hum outside her window, the book he had given her resting on the nightstand, open to a passage about courage as quiet persistence. She did not know what would come next, only that the calm she had felt was not lost, merely transformed, and that the choice she had made on a cold afternoon had placed her at the center of a reckoning that would demand steadiness from them both. The truth arrived on an ordinary afternoon, which was how Ethan chose it to be, stripped of spectacle and delivered with intention, because he understood now that revelations carried weight not because of volume, but because of timing. He asked Claire to meet him near the river where they had walked before, the path familiar, the air crisp, the city steady around them. And when she arrived, bundled against the cold, he noticed the way she searched his face before she spoke, already sensing that something had shifted. They stood for a moment without words, watching the water move beneath the bridge, And then Ethan took a breath and said there was something he needed to tell her, something he should have shared sooner, not as an omission meant to deceive, but as a delay born of caution. He explained that he had not come to the diner by chance, that finding her had required resources and authority he had not wanted to place between them. And as he spoke, Claire listened closely, her expression attentive rather than guarded, until he said his last name, Caldwell, and the sound of it seemed to change the air, recognition flickering across her face. The articles she had skimmed, the foundation banners she had seen, the scale of the world he moved within suddenly snapping into focus. She did not step back, but her posture shifted, a subtle straightening as she recalibrated what she thought she knew. Ethan continued, explaining who he was, what he led, and why he had chosen not to lead with any of it. He told her he wanted to be known as a person first, that he had valued the way she treated him without context, without calculation, and that revealing his identity earlier would have altered something he was not ready to lose. The honesty in his voice steadied the moment, yet the truth landed heavily nonetheless, because Claire now saw the full outline of the distance between their lives, the difference in power, in access, in consequence. And with that awareness came a surge of emotion she could not immediately name. She asked quietly whether everything they had shared had been real, whether his presence in her life had been an experiment or a distraction, and Ethan answered without hesitation, telling her that nothing with her had been a test, that if anything, she had tested him by reminding him who he wanted to be when no one was watching. The sincerity in his words softened the edge of her doubt, but questions remained. She asked why he had stayed, why he had continued to meet her without explanation, and he admitted that he had not been sure how to bridge the truth without turning it into a burden, that he had wanted to resolve the threat within his organization before it reached her, because he believed she deserved peace. The word peace echoed again, and Claire felt its weight differently now, because she understood that peace in his world required vigilance, that safety came with strings she had never needed to consider before. She told him she needed time, not because she was angry, but because understanding him fully meant understanding a system that could shape her life without her consent. Ethan accepted this without argument, telling her he would respect whatever distance she needed, that honesty did not entitle him to immediacy. They walked together toward the bus stop, the conversation lighter but careful, both aware that a line had been crossed that could not be redrawn. When they reached the corner, Claire paused and looked at him, asking one final question, whether the person responsible for the manipulation he had uncovered was someone she had met, and Ethan answered truthfully, that it was someone close to him, someone he had trusted for years, and that confronting this betrayal would require public action. The implication hung between them, because public action rarely remained contained. They parted with a quiet understanding, not resolved, not broken, but changed. Ethan watched her board the bus, the reflection of her face passing behind the glass once more, and he felt the cost of truth settle in, because revealing himself had not brought relief. It had introduced responsibility. Across the city, Claire sat by the window, the familiar streets sliding past, her thoughts a careful balance of memory and new context. She did not regret stepping forward that day. She did not regret knowing him. But she recognized now that the next choice she made would carry weight beyond her own life. And as the bus carried her home through the fading light, both of them understood that the story between them had entered a different chapter, one where trust would be tested not by silence, but by what each was willing to stand for in the open. The fallout began quietly, as betrayals often do, surfacing first as tension rather than headlines. And in the days following Ethan's revelation, the distance Claire had asked for settled into their interactions like a necessary pause. They did not stop speaking entirely, but their conversations shortened, grounded in updates and consideration rather than ease, because both understood that what lay ahead would reach beyond them. Ethan moved forward with precision, assembling documentation and corroboration that could withstand scrutiny, not to protect his reputation, but to protect the truth, because the evidence now pointed clearly to Victor Hale, a man whose loyalty had once been unquestioned, whose influence threaded through operations and partnerships alike, and exposing him would reverberate across the company and beyond. Meanwhile, Claire felt the ripple effects in subtler ways, a sense of being observed without being confronted, a shift in how unfamiliar faces lingered too. Long in the diner, nothing overt, nothing actionable, yet enough to sharpen her awareness. She did not tell Ethan at first, unwilling to add weight to what he already carried, but when he noticed the change in her voice during a brief call, she admitted that she felt watched, and his response was immediate, measured, reassuring without being dismissive. He asked questions, offered adjustments, suggested routes home that avoided routine, and though she bristled at the implication of vulnerability, she accepted the care behind it. Understanding that caution was not control, as the internal review progressed, Victor grew restless. His messages more frequent, his demeanor strained during meetings, and Ethan observed this with a calm that unsettled those around him. Because he did not confront Victor privately, he allowed the man space to reveal himself, to tighten his own net, while arrangements were made for a public reckoning that would leave no room for ambiguity. The announcement came in the form of a scheduled press briefing under the banner of transparency and accountability, framed as an update on governance and security reforms. And when Claire read about it in the morning paper, her stomach tightened. Recognizing the shape of what was coming, she went about her day with deliberate focus, grounding herself in routine. Yet when Ethan called that evening, his voice steady but resolute, she knew the moment had arrived. He told her that Victor would be named, that the evidence would be presented, that the story would shift from speculation to fact, and that there would be attention not only on the betrayal, but on the circumstances surrounding the incident, including the volunteer who had stepped forward. Claire listened, weighing the implications, the loss of anonymity she had guarded instinctively, and though fear brushed against her resolve, it did not take root, because she remembered the choice she had made and why. She asked Ethan what he needed from her, and his answer surprised her. He said he needed her consent, not her presence, that he would not mention her without her approval, that protecting her agency mattered more than controlling the narrative, the respect in. That offer steadied her, and after a moment, she told him he could tell the truth, that hiding would not make it safer, that courage did not end when the crowd dispersed. The next day, the city watched as Ethan stood before cameras, his tone composed, his words deliberate, outlining the findings with clarity, naming Victor Hale and the actions that had compromised trust, emphasizing accountability over accusation. And when he spoke of the incident downtown, he described it not as chaos, but as a breach created by manipulation. He acknowledged the volunteer who had intervened, not by name, but by action, highlighting her integrity without exposing her identity. And as the briefing concluded, the weight of the truth shifted the public conversation, reframing the event as a lesson in leadership rather than scandal. Claire watched from the break room at the diner, the sound muted, the image flickering across a small screen, and she felt a mix of relief and apprehension, because, while her name remained unspoken, the path ahead had changed irreversibly. Later that evening, Ethan and Claire met again by the river, the city lights reflecting in the water as they stood side by side, not touching, but aligned, and in that shared silence, they acknowledged what had been risked and what remained, because exposure had brought clarity, but it had also drawn a line that neither could ignore, and as the night deepened, both understood that the hardest part was not the truth revealed to the world, but the truth they would now have to live with together. In the days after the briefing, the city exhaled, headlines shifting from accusation to consequence. And with that shift came a quieter phase that demanded more from both of them than the noise ever had. Because when attention fades, choices remain. Ethan spent his mornings restructuring teams and reinforcing safeguards, not as a performance, but as a recalibration of values. He insisted on transparency in rooms where ambiguity had once been rewarded, and those who stayed understood that loyalty now meant integrity rather than proximity to power. Yet even as his professional world steadied, his personal one required patience, because Claire had stepped into visibility she had never sought, not through her name, but through the echo of her actions. Customers at the diner spoke in lowered voices about the incident, speculating without knowing, and while no one pointed to her directly, she felt the weight of recognition in small glances, questions left unasked. She responded by grounding herself more firmly in routine, arriving early, leaving on time, choosing familiarity as an anchor. Ethan noticed this and resisted the urge to intervene, understanding that support did not always mean stepping closer. Sometimes it meant standing back and letting strength take its own shape. They continued to meet, though less often, choosing moments that felt deliberate rather than habitual, walks that ended with thoughtful silence, conversations that explored values rather than plans. One evening, Claire spoke openly about her fear of becoming a symbol rather than a person, of having her life reframed by a single act, and Ethan listened without defense, acknowledging that the world had a way of flattening complexity. He told her that he would not allow her to be reduced, that if he used his voice, it would be to restore nuance, not erase it. The promise mattered, not because of his influence, but because it affirmed her agency. Meanwhile, the consequences for Victor Hale unfolded through proper channels. His removal handled without spectacle, his actions documented and addressed, and though the resolution brought closure, it also underscored a truth Ethan could not ignore. That trust once broken demanded vigilance going forward. This realization extended beyond his company to his relationships. And with Claire, he chose clarity over assumption, asking her what she needed rather than deciding for her. She asked for time and consistency, not declarations, not assurances of protection, but evidence that the man she had come to know existed beyond crisis. Ethan accepted this as both challenge and gift, because it required him to show up without leverage. Across the city, winter began to loosen its grip, the river thawing at the edges, sidewalks clearing, and with the change came a subtle lightness. Claire enrolled in an evening class she had postponed for years, sharing the news with Ethan as they sat on a bench watching the sun dip below the skyline. He congratulated her without offering to pay, a restraint that deepened her trust, because it honored her independence. In turn, she attended one of his public talks anonymously, standing near the back, listening as he spoke about leadership as responsibility rather than privilege, and in his words, she heard the echo of their conversations, the influence of being seen by someone who did not need him to be exceptional to be worthy. Afterward, they met briefly outside, exchanging a look that carried pride without possession. As the weeks passed, the question of what they were did not demand immediate answers. Instead, what mattered was what they were choosing, again and again: honesty, patience, respect. The absence of urgency allowed something durable to form, not as a reaction to danger, but as a response to truth. One night, walking Claire home beneath a sky cleared by early spring, Ethan stopped and admitted that the calm he felt now was unfamiliar, that he had built his life around control and contingency, and that letting uncertainty exist alongside care was a risk he was learning to take. Claire smiled, telling him that courage did not always announce itself. Sometimes it looked like staying when walking away would be easier, and as they stood there, the city breathing around them, both understood that the trial they had faced had not ended. Their story, it had refined it, leaving them with a foundation built not on rescue or revelation, but on the quieter strength of shared resolve. Spring arrived fully the morning Ethan asked Claire to meet him where everything had first shifted, not at the Civic Center entrance, but across the street beneath the row of young trees that now carried small green leaves, the city brighter, the air lighter, the past softened by time without being erased. Claire approached with measured curiosity, noticing the absence of tension she had grown accustomed to, and when she reached him, he greeted her with the same calm presence that had become familiar. Yet there was something deliberate in his posture, a sense of intention that steadied rather than startled her. They walked together toward a quiet bench overlooking the river, the water moving freely now, no longer edged with ice. And as they sat, Ethan reached into his bag and removed a carefully folded gray coat, the fabric worn, familiar, the sleeve bearing the faint crease she recognized instantly. He placed it between them without ceremony, explaining that he had kept it safe since the day downtown, that he had considered returning it many times, but that waiting had felt right, because objects carry meaning only when returned at the right moment. Claire touched the coat gently, memory washing through her, the cold, the crowd, the choice she had made without calculation, and she smiled, not with nostalgia, but with understanding. Ethan spoke then, not loudly, not with flourish, but with clarity. He said that when she stepped forward, she had given him something he could insulate rather than protect, and that exposing the betrayal within his organization had been only part of the work. The harder part had been deciding who he wanted to be afterward. Claire listened, the coat warm against her hands, feeling the weight of his words without feeling burdened by them. He continued, explaining that he did not want to frame what they shared as a debt repaid or a story completed, that he did not believe in rescuing or being rescued, only in choosing, again and again, to act with integrity. He asked her, simply, whether she would continue choosing him, not as a role, not as a symbol, but as a partner in the ordinary days ahead, days that would include disagreements and compromises and growth, days that would not always be quiet or easy, but would be honest. The question settled between them, open and respectful, and Claire considered it carefully, looking out at the river, thinking of the path she had walked since that cold afternoon, the way her life had expanded rather than contracted through truth. She answered by telling him that she did not need promises tied to status or security, that what mattered to her was consistency, presence, and the freedom to remain herself. She told him that she would walk forward with him as long as those things remained intact. Ethan nodded, accepting the conditions not as limitations, but as foundations, and in that moment, the choice was made without spectacle, two people aligning their lives through mutual consent rather than circumstance. They stood and walked along the path, the coat draped over Claire's arm, returned at last. As they moved, they spoke of plans that honored both their worlds, her classes continuing, his commitments evolving, shared spaces created slowly, intentionally, not as an escape, but as an expansion. Passers-by moved around them, unaware of the significance unfolding in quiet steps and measured words. And as they reached the bridge where the city opened wide before them, Ethan paused and took Claire's hand, not as a declaration, but as an agreement lived in action. She squeezed his hand in return, the gesture small yet resolute, and together they continued forward, the past integrated, the future unclaimed but welcomed, the meaning of that first act of shielding now fully realized, not as a moment of danger overcome, but as the beginning of a partnership grounded in courage, accountability, and choice. The months that followed unfolded without fanfare, marked not by dramatic turns, but by the steady accumulation of ordinary days lived with intention. Ethan and Claire did not rush to redefine themselves for the world. Instead, they allowed their lives to intertwine gradually, respecting the pace they had chosen together. Mornings often began apart, Ethan in meetings that now opened with questions about impact rather than margins. Claire on early buses carrying notebooks for her evening classes. Yet their evenings frequently converged in shared routines, simple dinners cooked together, walks along familiar streets, conversations that ranged from books and ideas to worries that no longer needed to be hidden. The city around them continued its rhythm, indifferent yet accommodating, and within it, they carved a space grounded in mutual regard. Ethan made changes that reflected his values, expanding community initiatives that prioritized direct support and transparency, ensuring that leadership roles rotated with accountability, not loyalty. And when he spoke publicly, he spoke less of himself and more of systems that uplifted without spectacle. Claire watched these shifts with a discerning eye, not as an admirer, but as a partner, offering perspective shaped by lived experience, reminding him when language drifted too far from reality. He welcomed this, understanding that her presence anchored him to purpose. Meanwhile, Claire's world expanded in tangible ways. Her classes challenged and energized her. Introducing new possibilities she approached with confidence earned rather than given. She remained at the diner part-time, not out of necessity alone, but because she valued continuity, the familiar faces, the reminder of where she had come from. And when coworkers asked about her life, she shared selectively, choosing authenticity over explanation. Their relationship did not escape notice, but it did not invite commentary either, because it was defined by how they treated each other rather than how others perceived them. One afternoon, as summer settled over the city, Ethan invited Claire to attend a small community event sponsored by his foundation, not as a guest of honor, but as a participant. She agreed on the condition that she could speak freely if asked, and when she did, sharing her perspective on dignity and choice, the room listened, not because of who stood beside her, but because of the clarity in her voice. Afterward, Ethan thanked her, not for lending credibility, but for reminding him that leadership thrived when it made room for voices like hers. As seasons shifted, The memory of the day that had brought them together receded into something quieter, no longer sharp with urgency, but integrated into their understanding of one another. They did not commemorate it with ceremonies or anniversaries. Instead, they honored it through consistency, by showing up when it mattered, by choosing honesty when it was inconvenient, by maintaining boundaries that protected individuality. Within togetherness, one evening, walking home beneath the glow of early autumn lights, Claire paused and reflected aloud on how close she had come to walking away when the truth first surfaced, how fear had tempted her toward distance, and Ethan listened, grateful for her candor. He admitted that he had feared losing her not because of what she represented, but because she had seen him without armor and chosen to stay. The acknowledgement settled between them as affirmation rather than dependence, and as they reached their building, he asked, not rhetorically but sincerely, whether she still felt free. Claire smiled and answered without hesitation that she did, because freedom, she had learned, was not the absence of connection, but the presence of choice within it. They stood there a moment longer, the city breathing around them, and in that stillness, the meaning of everything they had navigated came into focus, not as a story of rescue or redemption, but as a testament to what happens when courage meets accountability, when kindness is met with respect, when two people choose to grow rather than retreat. The world would continue to test them, as it always does, but they faced it not as symbols or opposites, but as partners aligned by values forged under pressure and sustained through care. And as they stepped inside, leaving the streetlights behind, the future unfolded not as a promise guaranteed, but as a path willingly shared, steady, deliberate, and open to all that remained to come.